In this video, I want to talk about buyer issues and objections that may arise as we approach the requirement for a buyer representation agreement. Now, come August 17th, any realtor working with a buyer must have that buyer sign a representation agreement prior to touring the first property. Now, in that buyer representation agreement is an obligation for the buyer to pay the broker's commission, which dramatically changes the landscape because prior to this, buyers and their agents had a very casual relationship, often nothing in writing, and an expectation that the commission for the buyer's agent would come from somewhere else, not the buyer. So now, with August 17th looming, there's going to be issues with an uncomfortable conversation that agents are going to have with their buyer where they slide over a contract and obligate that buyer to pay their commission. I got a question yesterday that I think is pertinent to a lot of agents because they're going to want to sidestep or avoid the blow that the buyer is going to take once they have to sign that obligation to pay a commission. So I'm going to read you this question, talk about buyer objections, talk about one issue in which a listing agent might have leverage over you and how you can overcome it or what you can do to counteract some of the restrictions you're facing. So here's the question. It asks, how can I fill out the representation agreement in a way that shows the buyer I do not intend to have them pay me directly in the event I can't secure commission from the seller? So this agent's looking for a way to alleviate the buyer's concern. You can imagine a buyer is going to look and think, wait, why am I signing something where I have to pay you 2.5%? I don't even have that. I don't know. I've been saving for my down payment. What's going on here? It turns into confrontation. So naturally, many agents, I think, are going to look for something like this. They're going to ask a question like this in the future, and they're going to say, what loophole or escape clause can I put into a representation agreement to calm the buyer down? I'll start by saying that the NAR settlement, you should be familiar with a few provisions because it really restricts what you can do and you don't want to paint yourself into a corner. So I'll say a few things. Number one is, don't be a buyer's agent that placates buyers by putting some very low amount in the representation agreement. You can imagine buyer's agents saying, hey, I'm the cheapest. I only put 0.5% or I only put 0.25%. Come with me, sign my buyer representation, not the other person's buyer representation. They're putting 2 or 3% on theirs. I'm putting 0.25% on mine. Well, part of the NAR settlement, a realtor cannot receive compensation greater, the word they use, exceeds the amount on the representation agreement. So now you have that restriction. So now you need to make sure you have a proper number in there. Now this person's asking about some sort of provision where they can stipulate that, hey, look, I'm putting 2.5% on there, but if I can't get paid by the seller, you don't have to pay anything. Well, that's prohibited too. I'm just going to come out with all the restrictions so we can talk about how you can navigate around this. There's another provision in the NAR settlement. If you go on Google, you type in NAR settlement PDF, you can look at the same thing I'm looking at. It's well over 100 pages. But basically it says that realtors are prohibited from offering free services unless they in fact are truly free. I'm paraphrasing right now. You can read the exact thing here, page 37 of 116 on that PDF. But you cannot stipulate that your services could be free or you may not charge something if you aren't truly going to do it. So if this agent was to put in, let's say he were to add verbiage that would say, hey, you don't pay anything if the seller isn't going to reimburse you or reimburse me or we get paid somewhere else from another source. Well, in theory, he could put that in the representation agreement. The problem is if the seller doesn't pay, if his bluff is called, he must work for free. And his brokerage or an agent's broker probably has a policy against working for free. Usually there's a minimum in any brokerage. So that right there eliminates itself. Now, I've seen agents look for another potential loophole in the representation agreement because on the page in the representation agreement where you put how much you're going to charge your buyer, there's a box you can check to, instead of putting a percentage like 2.5%, you can check a box and create a compensation schedule. The problem is that the compensation schedule must not be ambiguous. There can be no vagueness because that too is prohibited by the NAR settlement. And when I say in the NAR settlement, this is going to carry over, and it's going to be policy for the Association of Realtors, so for any realtor association plus the MLS. And so they write in here, the amount of compensation reflected, and this is, I'm referring to where agents are looking for a loophole, where they check the box for a compensation schedule, and then they write some sort of sliding scale, or they write something like, if the seller pays this, then that. If the buyer has to pay it all by himself, the buyer pays this. You can't do any of that. They write in here, it must be objectively ascertainable and not open-ended. They even give an example. Buyer broker compensation shall, so this is an example of what not to put, of what open-ended is. Buyer broker compensation shall be whatever the amount the seller is offering the buyer. You cannot put anything like that. So the takeaway from these restrictions is that when you create a buyer representation agreement, you are not adding any loophole verbiage. You are not adding an escape clause to placate or alleviate your buyer's concerns. I'll explain what you'll do. You're going to fill it out properly. You're going to put the proper commission you anticipate making, 2%, 2.5%, 3%, whatever. You're going to put that on there. Then you're going to have a conversation with your buyer and explain that now seller concessions are an integral part of the real estate industry. It's a conversation that listing agents are having with their sellers, and you should even show your buyer a purchase agreement and an SPBB form, seller's payment of buyer's broker, and then explain to your buyer, here's how it works. I'm going to request that the seller offer concession to you in which you're going to get a credit through escrow that's going to offset your obligation to pay me, your buyer's broker. And then that's the conversation of how you address the concern that the buyer is going to have about getting compensated or some sort of reimbursement from the seller for the obligation that they must make. Because here's the other factor to consider. Any realtor the buyer works with is going to require a representation agreement. Again, that requirement is that a realtor can't tour a home with a buyer until they have a representation agreement. So you're going to tell the buyer, look, it's not just me. It's not that I'm super uptight or I'm unique in any way in terms of paperwork and forcing this upon you. This is the standard. This is the requirement. Did you hear about the lawsuit? This is what it means. It now means all buyers have to sign this with their realtor. And you fall back on the explanation of seeking compensation from the seller through the SPBB form. You explain how concession's done. This is no different than what agents that have worked with, let's say, FHA buyers or buyers that have a small down payment, or if you go back far enough, back when there used to be 100% financing, this was very common where agents, this was very common a long time ago in the subprime days, where there was all the crazy financing that got everyone in trouble to begin with. Well, a lot of buyers had like no cash. So what would they do for closing costs? They'd ask for a seller concession. So it was commonplace for agents to explain what a seller concession was and how they were going to ask for the seller to pay through escrow a concession, a credit, to help that buyer with the amount of cash you need to bring to closing. Well, fast forward, it's the same concept, but in a different application. You're explaining to your buyer, listen, this is a commitment that any realtor in the country must follow. This is a requirement now that we have a buyer representation agreement, and I can't put some phony number in here, and I can't put some sort of loophole either. Everything's been thought out. There are restrictions here, but what I can tell you is here's our strategy. Here's how we're going to have the seller credit you through escrow, which in turn is going to offset your obligation to pay me. That's it. That's the explanation. Now, this agent asks a follow-up question, which is valid as well, because this isn't a perfect science. There are ways where buyer's agents can be undermined and the system can be used against them, and I'll explain that. I'll explain how to counter that as well. So this agent writes a follow-up question saying, what if they won't work with me, just considering the very slim risk that I can't get the seller to offer concession, that the buyer would in fact ultimately be responsible for the buyer's agent compensation? Well, and then this agent finishes saying, does that mean that the buyer has the only option left of going to the listing agent directly? these are great questions because sooner or later, every buyer's agent is going to have to face scenarios like this or at least think out this scenario. So if you have a buyer that cannot commit because of the risk of the buyer's agent compensation, again, this is assuming that you've already explained the strategy of the seller's payment of buyer's broker or seeking a seller concession, and you've explained everything to them that every other realtor in America is going to require the same document. This is not unique to you. If the buyer still has an issue with that, number one, I think that's a red flag. And in my other video, I said if the buyer is not going to conform to standards, just move on. Okay, but let's assume that you really want to work with this buyer. This agent's asking, what can they do at this point? Can they go to the listing agent directly? Could this buyer, in theory, cut out this agent? Consider this. If you have a buyer representation agreement signed, that buyer's yours, and you don't have to worry about them cutting you out on a property you showed to them. That's the protection, that's the benefit of the buyer representation agreement. Could they cut you out and go to the listing agent? Only on a property that they are going to see without you. But here's the other thing. The listing agent's a realtor too. So for the listing agent to represent the buyer, that automatically spurs the requirement of the same buyer representation agreement that this buyer is trying to avoid. But there is a loophole. I'll explain. Hopefully I'm not going too far down the rabbit hole here, but in the new listing agreement, there's the second line in the compensation section is adding additional compensation to the listing broker, the seller's broker, if the buyer's unrepresented. This is a poison pill. This actually I think is a bad thing and should not be in there. But I'll explain what you can do around it. The best effort you can to subvert this being used against you. In theory, a buyer could go to the listing agent and let's say a buyer refused to sign their representation agreement. You've explained to them, every realtor does it. You've explained to them how you're going to seek payment from the seller. They're still not satisfied. They want to go directly to the listing agent. At a certain point, you can't force buyers to sign this. If they want to opt out of the system, they're more than welcome to. They do not have to do it. They can self-represent. The vast majority of buyers are not competent to self-represent or go unrepresented. Many think they are. They're not. I worked in for sale by owner division for many years, and I just saw how absolutely helpless people are, even intelligent people, even attorneys, you name it. A lot of these people are totally helpless and will one way or another sabotage a simple real estate transaction. Now let's say the buyer goes to an agent, a listing agent. If that listing agent filled out their listing agreement with the seller and they're getting additional compensation for unrepresented buyers, and watch my listing agreement tutorial and you'll see exactly where it's at, that incentivizes listing agents to welcome unrepresented buyers. Let's call them misfit buyers. They welcome these misfit buyers, and then they feed into their idea of being able to do the transaction without guidance or help. The listing agent may offer minimal guidance, likely guidance that is against policy and unethical. A listing agent can't just give a blank RPA to a buyer. A listing agent shouldn't be filling out the RPA for a buyer. The listing agent shouldn't be proposing terms for a buyer or offering suggestions, because of course the listing agent works on behalf of the seller. It's like getting divorced and having your spouse's divorce attorney draw up your paperwork or advise you on what's best for you. Do you want your spouse's attorney looking out what's best for you in a divorce because you go unrepresented? Hey, I don't need an attorney. I'll just have my spouse's attorney do everything for me in our divorce proceedings. It's insane. Apply that to the same scenario. So what you need to do is inform your buyer, explain to them that if they go unrepresented to a listing agent and they need any help from a listing agent, which most buyers will. Do you think a buyer has a copy of a purchase agreement just on hand? Do you think a buyer knows how to fill one out on hand? What fraction of 1% of buyers actually does? Maybe a retired real estate agent, maybe a real estate attorney that's buying unrepresented, but what percentage of buyers are retired real estate attorneys or retired agents? You must explain to your buyer that if they're unrepresented and they get any guidance or help from a listing agent, that they need to understand that listing agent is simply accommodating that buyer to be paid more, and any guidance, any advice, any help from that listing agent is going to be biased because you are asking the representative, the fiduciary for the other team, the seller, the other person in the transaction, the person you're negotiating against, adversarially negotiating against another party on who can get the best deal, what the best terms are for whom. That's the person that you're getting advice from, and they're being paid if they don't represent you. So if they think they can go to the listing agent and get actual representation, you need to inform your buyer. If you want representation from the listing agent, that listing agent's name needs to go as the buyer's agent on the contract. And guess what? They're back in the same boat of needing representation and the buyer paying. Nowhere else is buyer compensation stipulated for a buyer's agent, not in the listing agreement. So that listing agent will still need to get a representation agreement or some sort of commission commitment from the buyer, and they're back at square one. There's no way for a buyer to circumvent their agent and get any sort of help or guidance without going right back to square one and getting paid representation. And you need to inform your buyer that if they're getting any help whatsoever, anything, any assistance, that agent helping them must be listed as a representative on the contract, or else they're getting guided by the other team's fiduciary. I rambled too long. I hope this helps. If you have any questions, please leave a comment. Thanks for watching.